Rhett and Link Deconstructed, and so did I. Let's talk about that. A couple of months ago, Rhett and Link from Good Mythical Morning shared their deconstruction stories on their podcast called Ear Biscuits.
I'm just trying to be as honest about my own situation as possible and approach this with as much humility as possible.
Deconstruction was originally a term used to describe critically analyzing a text or philosophy, but is now a term being used to describe the process of questioning your beliefs or where your beliefs came from. I prefer this new and up-and-coming term deconstruction over terms like deconversion, losing your faith, or apostasy. I think those terms kind of imply that you did something wrong or gave up, when people who have gone through the process of deconstruction know that that's not the case. From the inside of religious communities, deconstruction can often look really scary because skepticism and doubt is something that religions often teach against. Especially in the case of Christianity, this is something that the Bible very much speaks against. But many people who have actually gone through the process of deconstruction will tell you that it can actually be a really beneficial experience. When I first came out of the other side of my deconstruction, I actually had a blog to write about everything that I was learning. And I ended up writing an article called How to Have an Existential Crisis, because I was like, maybe this isn't so bad. Like, maybe we should question everything. Although I will say that sometimes an existential crisis can be really hard and scary. Understanding deconstruction can be difficult for those who haven't gone through it for several reasons. Here are a few. First of all, it takes a lot of emotional maturity to understand anything that you haven't gone through. Secondly, the church often teaches people apologetics that make people feel like they understand what skeptics and non-religious people are going through. Thirdly, non-believers who have had less interaction with religion may not understand why this would greatly affect your sense of meaning or how you interpret your interactions with the world. They can seem very unsympathetic if their attitude is like, I don't know why you even believed in any of that in the first place. So Rhett shares his story first, and it is uncanny how similar his story is to mine. In fact, the entire time I was watching, I was sitting there like, me too! Rhett and Link grew up in the church, and Rhett talks about how he believed so strongly that he would argue with evolutionists and atheists about how true the Bible was, and he loved literature that supported his idea that it was so reasonable to believe in the Bible. He says that later on he came to realize that the science really does contradict some of what the Bible states, but says that he doesn't think that Christians misrepresented the science to him on purpose.
I don't think that they're being deliberately deceptive. I want to be clear about that. I don't think these people are sitting around there like, oh, we see these facts and we're going to misrepresent them because we're going to lie about this. I think that they're good people.
He talked about how he had a very real relationship with God, and when he had questions, he would kind of rely on these Christian apologists to have the answers. But when he started to go through the deconstruction process, he realized that what the Christian apologists had taught him was breaking down. Even when he was realizing that what the Bible had to say was maybe not 100% true, he still told himself all truth is God's truth, and searching through this is not going to hurt my relationship with God. Rhett had questions based off of science that directly contradicted the Bible's claims, and he talks about how Christianity mostly survives off of the idea that the Bible is infallible. But he started to realize at the very least that there's a lot of gray and that the truth is not black and white. He also talked about how when you question things within the church, there are factors that can affect your survival, and there's many emotional factors at play as well. Still, he was honest with people and he let them in on what was going on with him. And it's common when someone questions their core beliefs for people to have strong reactions.
And I was slowly letting people that I loved, including my wife, in on some of this stuff. And every time I would bring up a piece of it, she would just start crying.
He talks about how when core beliefs start to come into question that you can rationalize by saying, well, people that are smarter than me believe this, or you start to factor in how much of an investment you've made into this belief system already. People can invest many aspects of their lives into belief systems, and it's because they've made very real life sacrifices that they can fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is a bias from ongoing commitment that makes it so that you want to interpret information and make decisions to make it so that your investments will work out instead of cutting your losses. This is why people can stay stuck in pyramid schemes or keep going with bad business practices that aren't working out. The conditions that Rhett grew up in and the people that he surrounded himself with made Christianity feel really real to him.
And I don't have it all figured out, and it is gray, but it feels so true.
He talks about how even when he was going through all of this at first, Christianity still felt really real to him. And we will talk more on this channel about some of the reasons why our beliefs can feel so true and how it takes a lot to undo all of that. And I'm going to talk about it more when I make a video on the details of my personal deconstruction, but there were structures in place in the way that I grew up and even into my adulthood that really reinforced the idea that what the Bible said was the absolute truth. Rhett talks about how he experienced cognitive dissonance when he was dealing with all this conflicting information that he was wrestling with, really.
I just felt like I was just completely in my mind, and I made this whole thing like scientific and intellectual. And also, it seemed like I was being arrogant because I was waiting for God to fit my expectations. I was creating God in my own image as opposed to God creating me in his image. I had flipped the script on God and was waiting for him to like be my little trick pony that does all the things that I want him to do in order for me to believe in him. There's a verse that kind of gets into
Which
this.
was answers, basically.
Isaiah 55 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts." So
God's saying, I'm bigger than you.
Right.
There's certain things you just can't get, dude.
Yeah, and at this point I was like, okay, you know what? I think this is probably where faith comes in. You know, it makes sense to me that this might be where faith comes in because I am sitting here trying to prove this stuff out, but shouldn't I just have faith first? And then maybe these answers will be given to me by God? Isn't this what faith is all about? I mean, the whole point is it's evidence of things not seen, right?
I also had cognitive dissonance when I was educated in college and learned science that directly contradicted the Bible. I resolved my cognitive dissonance by looking to the Bible for answers, and I found a verse that helped me cope with my conflicting feelings. So I'm going to read it to you from my phone. "Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. And when I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." So I read that verse and I told myself, see, education will pass away. That's not what's gonna matter in eternity. Love is what's gonna matter in eternity. Oh, I just wanna shake my past self and be like, education is great and it can help you love people even better. But I've also worked really hard to forgive my past self.
But the major shift for me occurred when I asked a question I had never asked. I've been very, very afraid to ask this question, and that was, what if I'm wrong?
Rhett talks about how he just tried to have faith despite his questions. But when you do this, you avoid truth and you just fuel your own confirmation bias. But when he was really honest with himself, he came to different conclusions.
And when I was honest with myself, the Bible began to make a lot more sense to me personally as a product of humans rather than God. It seemed less and less like God's message to people and more like people's best guesses about God. And in that, it became a lot like any other holy text.
I think that the verses in the Bible that talk about how when you seek God, you will find him is early humans trying to articulate the exact experience that they were having. When they believed more, they felt God more. And that was a result of confirmation bias or self-fulfilling prophecy. They looked for something and then manifested it into their reality because our brains are so good at looking for the information that we're trying to see. Also, I realized that I say early humans when I mean earlier humans. Humans have been around for like a really long time, and I'm usually referring to humans that were around like only 2,000 years ago, but I will try not to mess up quite as much from now on. So Rhett wanted to believe, and he says how he didn't go through any of this process in a cave. He let people in on all of his questioning and everything that was going on with him. He had a problem with the idea of hell and people burning for billions and billions of years just for not believing in this religious text, especially when people don't choose to be born in the first place. Growing up as a Christian, I would think that all the time. I was taught that I was supposed to suffer for the sake of the gospel, but I thought this was weird when I didn't even choose to be born. Rhett talks about how he has always tried to approach all of his questions with a lot of humility. And that's something that I didn't understand until I went through deconstruction myself. It is actually very humbling to realize that most of what you thought your entire life was quite possibly wrong. And you're even further humbled if you decide to be honest about it with people, especially when you know that apologetics gives people their answers before they've even heard you speak. The Bible talks about how Christians are supposed to be quick to listen and slow to speak, but a lot of Christians diagnose the problem completely from their own point of view. And Rhett understood how people were hearing him because he used to think exactly like them. He talks about how it hurts him when people try to tell him his own experience, and I definitely relate to that. So he's seen people try to diagnose his problem by saying, I know what happened. You just moved to LA and you lost your faith. And lo and behold, after the podcast came out, there were many videos trying to diagnose Rhett and Link's problem, some of which said the exact diagnosis that Rhett was talking about. You moved to LA and you lost your faith. Rhett and Link just moved to LA and they want to be liked. But if Rhett and Link just want to be liked and not be controversial, why bring up this touchy subject in the first place? Rhett describes that he went through what he calls a brief period of atheism and anger, but he didn't want to have the same dogma as before. There's a part of the podcast where it seems like Rhett is kind of equating atheism with anti-theism and being angry. And this is something that I would like to talk about. So when we're answering the question that's asked in the thumbnail of this video, are Rhett and Link atheists? No, they do not currently identify as atheists. They currently identify as agnostics. Rhett talks about how he doesn't want to be an atheist because he doesn't want to have the same dogma that he did before. And these are feelings that I definitely relate to. In Link's deconstruction story, which I'm not going to cover in as much detail, but please go watch both of them if you haven't already. It's on their channel called Ear Biscuits. Link says that he doesn't want to be an atheist, and Rhett asks Link why he doesn't want to be an atheist. And his answer is that he doesn't want to come down hard on religion and that he wants to be open-minded. But he does say that he could see himself being what he calls a practical atheist. He sees the atheist label as too definitive, and he likes the label that means you just don't know. And this is exactly how I felt in the time immediately following my deconstruction process. Originally, after my deconstruction process, I identified as an agnostic as well, and it was for the same reasoning. I didn't want to be dogmatic. I'll get to why I identify as an atheist now instead of an agnostic in another video, because I have very specific reasons why I chose to change how I label myself. But I'm not pro-atheism. I'm pro-critical thinking, which is what ultimately led me to atheism and agnosticism. Atheism does not have to be dogmatic and is ultimately a better description of where I stand. It can get confusing because atheists and Christians might have totally different understandings of the same terms. I know that when I learned about atheism in Christian institutions, I was taught something completely differently than how I see atheism now. So when Rhett's describing where he stands, he says,
So I would call myself a hopeful agnostic.
here's a picture of me in 2016 when I was writing a blog. Guess what that blog was called? The Enthusiastic Agnostic. Tell me that that's not a fun coincidence. I had those business cards made because I got really excited about becoming a writer. Becoming a writer was a lifelong dream of mine, and what have I been doing since then? Trying to come up with the time, energy, and guts to make a YouTube channel. And here we are in 2020. Towards the end of the podcast, Rhett and Link talk about how they had each other to confide in when they were going through this process. But some people go through this process and don't have people in their lives that they can confide in. They have to find a kind of support network in books and online, which is why I'm so motivated to make these videos. I want to be a type of support for people who are questioning things. I don't have all of the answers. I mean, nobody does, but I just think it would be so cool to give people the tools that were so helpful to me when I was going through this.
I've been pulling on this thread and it had sort of like turned into a vest and then a midriff and then a halter top and now it was a string bikini.
It's not appropriate.
And I was like, I'm gonna take the bikini off.
Really not appropriate.